Hi there and welcome to another video for EC102. This is going to be focusing on part 2 topic, specifically the aggregate demand and aggregate supply diagrams, the ISLM diagram, the Keynesian cross diagram and the money market diagram. This is going to be loosely based on what we covered in problem set 4 of part 2, so I'm going to take one of the questions as a point of departure, but I'll try and give as much background info on the solution that I provide as we go. The first thing that we're going to talk about today is the Keynesian cross diagram. So the Keynesian cross diagram gives us a relationship between expenditure and income or output. That relationship is defined by the planned expenditure function, which is consumption plus investment plus government spending. We can further refine this particular identity by noting that consumption, at least in all of our cases, is usually given by the functional form C0 plus C1 times income, but now we're specifically talking about disposable income, YD. We also want to make sure that we capture the relationship between investment and real interest rates. So we let that be a function of our real interest rate R, and we'll just take G as exogenous. The last refinement I want to make to this equation is to note that the disposable income is just income less taxes. So that gives us the equation that we're going to graph on the Keynesian cross diagram. Using this equation, noting that it gives us a relationship between Y and the value of PE, we draw that as something like this, planned expenditure. In equilibrium, in the Keynesian cross market, or in the goods market more generally, in equilibrium, we know that the amount of income available must equal the amount of income that we plan to spend. So in other words, if we impose this into here, we can solve for a expenditure income pair. Whoops, I don't know why that's a P. This equation now gives us the equilibrium value in the Keynesian cross model. We can draw a 45-degree line. A 45-degree line is just a line on a 2D graph that tells me all the points where my y-axis value and my x-axis value equal each other. So at all the points on the blue dashed line, we have that y equals planned expenditure. The intersection point here is the point in this space that solves this equation, where planned expenditure equals available income. And that's going to suggest to us the equilibrium level of income. So we'll call that Y1, because that's where the economy is starting as an equilibrium point of departure. I'm going to go ahead now and use this as my point of departure for question 2 in problem set 4 of part 2. So the question asks us to show the impact of an exogenous increase in government spending, or I think it says public expenditure, which is the same as government spending. So an exogenous impact in government spending will impact the planned expenditure curve by increasing G here. So I'm going to show that as a shift in planned expenditure to a new higher level, PE2. And let's just remind ourselves that PE2 is some function of variables, one of which is G2. Let me just get rid of this so that we can get a bit more space happening. Right, a reminder that this was the original planned expenditure curve, which was a function of a whole bunch of different variables, one of which was G1. Let me give us some more space because my space management was not particularly good for this initial point. And we just want to remind ourselves that what happened to G? Well, we went from G1 to G2, and let's note that G2 is bigger than G1. So we have some shift in our planned expenditure function, which gives us a new equilibrium value from the Keynesian cross model. Well, let me not say a new equilibrium value. Let me say that from a shift in government spending, or from an exogenous increase in government spending, we now have upward pressure on the equilibrium level of income in the short run. So let's say that we started at Y1 and we now have upward pressure towards Y2. The reason we don't want to say that we have a new equilibrium value at this stage is because implicit in what we've already done, we've taken R and we've taken P as fixed. We've assumed that the price level in the economy is completely fixed, and we've also assumed that the interest rate in the economy is completely fixed. So for the Keynesian cross model, R and price level are taken as exogenous and fixed. But we know that there are other dynamics in the economy such that when we have upward pressure on output in the short run, that there's going to be some relationship between that upward pressure on output and interest rates, and there's going to be some relationship between that upward pressure and the interest rate effect it gives, which flows through to prices in the short run. So at this point, all we're going to note is that we have upward pressure on Y. Let's now move to our ISLM model. The ISLM model, again, has short-run output on the y-axis. We have the real interest rate on, short-run output on the x-axis, or y here, and we have on the y-axis the real interest rate. And we have one upward sloping curve, which is the LM function, and we have one downward sloping curve, which is the IS function. The reason we have these relationships, just to recap, is that we know that as interest rates go up, there is some force, I should restate that. As Y increases, we have upward pressure on interest rates through the increased money demand, so that the new interest rate as Y increases from a money perspective should be higher, such that the money demand and money supply can be equated. So that's the upward sloping nature of the LM curve. The downward sloping nature of the IS curve is defined as when interest rates increase, we have a decrease in investment in planned expenditure, and as investment decreases, we have the decrease in our short-run output. So that's just quick revision about the IS and LM curve. So far, we've argued from our Keynesian cross model that an increase in G puts upward pressure on short-run output. Because we have, for any given R, remember that R here was taken as fixed in the Keynesian cross model when we're analysing the impact of G. So for all values of this fixed R, the initial analysis in the Keynesian cross model suggests that we have a higher level of short-run output or income. So that's going to be represented as a shift in the IS curve, and for any given level of I, for any given level of Y, we would now have a, for any given level of R, we now have a higher level of Y. So we have a rightward shift in the IS curve. And again, we can just remind ourselves that this was because of moving to G2, and this was because we were initially at G1. So this rightward shift in the IS curve tells us a few things. First of all, let's just look at where we would have moved in a world where interest rates did not change. What happened? Well, we started in equilibrium in the ISLM market at Y1, R1. If interest rates were not able to move, as we assumed in the Keynesian cross model where interest rates were fixed, then we argued that we had an increase from Y1 to Y2. And this Y2 corresponds to the Y2 that we were moving towards when we had a model of just planned expenditure equaling income with fixed R and fixed prices. But we know from the ISLM model that as we have an upward pressure on short-run output, we also have upward pressure on interest rates. The upward pressure on interest rates comes from the money market. Maybe I'll quickly draw that, just to remind ourselves what's going on. In the money market, we have real balances, we have money supply in real terms, and we have money demand in real terms. The money demand is, in real terms, is a function which we could specify specifically as y 1 minus r. That's a specific functional form. The more important feature is that we're capturing the relationship in terms of a downward slope. So we need to have some negative relationship between real money demand and r. Now, let's return to the ISLM model. We said for a fixed r, we had upward pressure on real output in the short run from y1 to y2. What that does in the money market is it's going to shift the money demand function. As we have upward pressure on y, then the money demand function is going to shift to the right. So let's write md p as a function of y2, 1 minus r. This was y1. So now what we see is that because of this upward pressure on short-run output, we also have upward pressure on real interest rates. Because people want to hold more money, but we don't have any more money being supplied in the economy, so we have upward pressure on interest rates. What this looks like in the ISLM context is it looks like shift along the LM curve. So that's why from our initial realization that the shift in government spending shifted the planned expenditure curve, which put upward pressure on output. This upward pressure on output was somewhat offset by the mechanism from the money market that says that when output goes up, the real interest rate goes up. So the ISLM model shows that initially we had a tendency to go from y1 to y2, but concurrently we put upward pressure on interest rates, and this upward pressure on interest rates meant that instead of realizing the outcome y2, we really only ended up moving towards or in the direction of y3, because the interest rate effect offset some of this initial government spending, so that we didn't have y2 as our sort of center of gravity in the model. We were only ever going to make it to y3. So now, from the ISLM model, our argument is that we have pressure in the economy that pushes from y1 towards y3 and pushes from r1 towards r2. But again, this is not the end of the story, because in the Keynesian cross world, we treated r and p as fixed. We then saw that introducing the ISLM framework, specifically through the money market channel, that when we don't have r as being fixed, we have some offsetting force in the economy. But we still assumed in this world that p was fixed. So in the Keynesian cross model, we took r as fixed and p as fixed, and we did our analysis. In the ISLM model, with the money market defining the LM relationship, we took r as flexible and let p remain fixed. So now, to complete this story, we need to move into the world of the aggregate supply and aggregate demand in the short run graph. What that's going to enable us to do is analyze the final effect on output. Maybe I'll move to a whole new page. The aggregate supply and aggregate demand functions, which is again having y on the x-axis, and now we have the price level in the economy on the y-axis. Aggregate demand is a downward sloping relationship between price and short-run output. Aggregate demand is actually just defined by equilibrium in the ISLM model. Equilibrium in the ISLM model is what defines all those set of points. Now let's look to the short-run supply curve. I'm drawing the short-run aggregate supply curve as being upward sloping to suggest that in the short run, we do have some responsiveness from the price level to changes in short-run output. In other words, if short-run output has upward pressure being exerted on it, then so too do prices have upward pressure being exerted on them. All else being equal, an above long-run level of short-run output puts upward pressure on prices. A below long-run level of short-run output puts downward pressure on prices. We aren't, however, making the full assumption, as we do in the long run, that these effects are always and everywhere driven by money. What we're going to do is show that in the short run, the dynamics that impact price can come from a range of sources. So let's think now how we would draw our Y1 to Y3, R1 to R2 shift in the ASAD model. Well, because we have an increase in output for a fixed P, remember in this world we treated P as fixed, for any given price level, what we're saying now is that aggregate demand is higher. So we have aggregate demand 2, which was a function of government spending 2. The original aggregate demand 1 was a function of government spending 1. And what we've said is that if the price level was kept fixed from our initial equilibrium, what we would have is we would have a movement from Y1 to Y3. Now this movement from Y1 to Y3 already captures the fact that our initial movement from Y1 to Y2 was offset somewhat by the increase in interest rates, which came from increased money demand, which put upward pressure on rates, which offset somewhat our tendency to move to Y2. So Y2, just to remind you, would be somewhere out here. We're only moving to Y3 now, but again, just as the interest rate effect offsets some movement from Y1 to Y2, we now have the price effect as illustrated in the ASAD model, which is offsetting some movement from Y1 to Y3. Because as the economy moves from Y1 to Y3, we said as before that the short-run aggregate supply curve tells us that some of this tendency to move from Y1 to Y3 is offset because there is upward pressure on prices as short-run output increases. So there's pressure to move from Y1 to Y3. Some of that is offset by the upward pressure on prices, and we now only arrive at Y4. And at Y4, we have a new price level in the economy, P2. We went from P1 to P2. So just one last time, let's remind ourselves how we ended up showing that an increase in G from G1 to G2, where G2 was larger than G1, meant that we had an increase in price from P1 to P2, an increase in output from Y1 to Y4. Let's tell that story one more time, and then what we're going to do is we're going to go back through the steps, starting at the ASAD curve and showing how all of these things are now going to inform the model that we use to underpin the final result. But one more time with feeling, what was the driving force of Y1 to Y4? Initially, increase in government spending put upward pressure on output at a given level of interest rates and a given price level. The IS curve shifted, but we also know that as the upward pressure on Y was exerted from our Keynesian cross world, we had this reciprocal change in money demand, which is a function of Y. So as money demand was shifted rightward, or there was an increase in money demand for a given rate, we had an increase in the equilibrium real interest rate that clears the money market, and this was likewise captured as a shift along the LM curve, where the interest rate effect offsets somewhat our increase in output, and our new direction of travel is Y1 to Y3, with R1 to R2. But all of this took the price level as fixed. When we move into the aggregate supply, aggregate demand world, we see that allowing the price level to adjust somewhat, even in the short run, meant that after we shifted our aggregate demand curve, when we have this upward pressure on output, likewise we have some increased pressure on prices. This price upward pressure offsets somewhat the increase in output, and the final amount of change in the output level is down to Y4. We're not done, however, unfortunately. To be really rigorous about this question, we then need to recognize that since P has changed here, we should go back to the IS model and understand that previously this took the original price level P1 as fixed. We now need to reconcile that P1 has moved to P2. What is that going to look like in this model? Well, we don't see any prices in the IS side, or the real economy side. We only ever see prices in the money side, or the LM side of the economy, of the short run analysis economy. So in the short run, assuming that prices have gone from P1 to P2, we need to recognize that this effectively shifts the LM curve leftward. Why does the LM curve shift left? Because now, with higher prices, we have a decrease in money supply. As prices go up, money supply in real terms goes down, and we have a left shift in money supply. We could have just gone straight to the LM model and recognized that as prices increase for a given level of output, we now have an even higher level of real interest. So this looks like a shift in the LM curve leftward. LM at price level 2, this was LM at price level 1. So again, what we have shown in the IS model is that when the new price level, which is treated as exogenous in the ISLM model, when the new price level that was driven up through the ADAS pressure is obtained, then in the ISLM model, we can show that we indeed do end up at output level of Y4, and we have an interest rate level that is now at R3. So the interest rate is actually greater than we had initially pegged it down as, because this final increase in price reduces the money supply in real terms, which is going to reduce the, increase the real interest rate, or show a shift in the LM curve, which is why we arrive at Y4. Which is important because we argued that we ended up at Y4 in the ADAS model. We need to show that that is the outcome in all of our other models also. So we have further increase in rates and a shift in LM, and we arrived at Y4. But again, we're not done, because if we go all the way back to the Keynesian cross model, which initially took rates as fixed and prices as fixed, we know now that rates have increased, prices have increased. So how can we show this on the Keynesian cross model? Well, importantly, it's going to be the rate effect that changes how we define our complete finished story in this model. Because interest rates have gone up, we've shown that they went from R1 to R3. Interest rates have gone up. That tells me that the I, or investment, has gone down in our planned expenditure function. Remember, this was exactly the channel that we talked about as defining the downward sloping nature of the IS curve. So we have a shift downward in planned expenditure. I'm going to draw it as dashed so that we can recognize the difference. We now have planned expenditure 3, which is a function of G2 R3. And just to finish this analysis, we can show that the equilibrium in the Keynesian cross model also ends at point Y4. So we've shown now how to build up towards the aggregate supply, aggregate demand curve, justifying the impacts of a shift in G in first a simple model where where P and R are fixed, then in a more nuanced model where only P is treated as fixed, and finally in a world where we even allow price to be somewhat flexible in the short run. We then follow through we trace our steps back to the original graphs so that we can show that this price level effect was resolved in the ISLM model, and this interest rate effect was rationalized in the Keynesian cross model. In an exam, you may not have to be quite as thorough as this. It might be simple just to go straight to, for instance, the ISLM and the ASAD model. This is both an attempt to show you a full way to analyze the question, but it's also a good way to help you build up towards a more intuitive, more quickly applied ability to shift, for example, the ISLM model or shift aggregate demand based on knowledge of a particular factor. The last thing I briefly want to mention is that you should test yourself at home by trying to do this analysis for things that change the real economy, which is basically the IS side. What can change the IS side? Well, anything that affects planned expenditure. So we have our parameters, C1 and C0. These will have an effect that shifts planned expenditure function. So therefore, we could do a similar analysis to what we just did using the underlying initial point of departure as a change in one of these variables. We could also think about changes in T or changes in G. From the monetary side or the LM side, probably the only thing you need to worry about from that perspective is thinking about some exogenous money demand shock, which is what you're told to think about in problem set 4, question 4, or we might be told that there's some change in the money supply. So these two things are just going to be shifts in the money demand curve or the money supply curve. The ones that we think of as being the most interesting in some sense is how G affects the economy in the short run and how MS affects the economy in the short run. In particular, we think about these as being the two levers that government and monetary authorities can pull in order to shape somehow the short run outcomes in terms of price and short run output. And the last more difficult thing to try and think about is what would happen if we had one of these shocks or we had some exogenous money demand shock. How might the government or the money authority then use their ability to affect G or MS in order to offset the short-run impacts of these shocks? And that's kind of building up towards basically a very stylized model of how governments and how monetary authorities behave in the real economy. They attempt to try and offset or stabilize short-run levels of output. So they observe that there's, for example, some exogenous money demand shock, and they then respond by either changing G or changing money supply in order to offset the short-run impacts of that initial shock. But the analysis can be done in the exact same way, starting at the most micro level, either in the Keynesian cross model or in the money market, building up towards the ISLM model, putting it all together in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram, and making sure that the implications of the latter flow back in through to the former. That's all I want to say about this model. It's important that you practice this. The graphical analysis will be quite important in having success in this subject. So be aware that you understand the relationships the graphs show, how shifts occur, and the flow-on effects from ADAS, ISLM, Keynesian cross, and money market. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.